Back to today's video. Today is Monday, September 2nd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the national generic ballot and Democrats expanding their lead to the highest point ever in this general election season for the 2024 presidential election. When you take a look at the 538 average for generic ballot polling data of the 2024 election, Democrats have not had a lead this high since over a year ago in mid-2023. It comes at a time where Democrats are really hoping that the enthusiasm and excitement for Vice President Kamala Harris translates to down-ballot victories in battleground states that are hosting competitive Senate races and gubernatorial races, and of course congressional House races that are super important in legislating for the future elections. Now, the 2024 cycle has really been a whiplash, to say the least, for the Democratic Party. They have been at points where the American public was not super thrilled or enthusiastic around people like Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden. Around the time in the aftermath of the presidential debate, it very much seemed like we were slow walking into a Donald Trump presidency, that at every point onward beyond that debate, Donald Trump was the assured victor, and it was a question of margin rather than if he wins. Now, it was even translated by some of these House Democrats to the Biden administration, to President Biden himself, when they were able to meet with him. We saw that a lot of the data points that were circulating around from President Biden and those closest to him was that President Biden ultimately decided that he was going to withdraw from the race, not necessarily because of his numbers looking bad, but because it translated to down-ballot ramifications for the National Democratic Party. And we saw that in the immediate aftermath of the debate. Democrats were hovering around being ahead of Republicans, but never by more than half a point, and Republicans eventually were able to really narrow down the generic ballot to a point where voters weren't thrilled about either side of the aisle. And what we know historically is that when the generic ballot is narrower, Republicans tend to do better. Generally speaking, Democrats do in fact win the national popular vote, even when it comes down to congressional elections, even if they aren't necessarily winning the majority of House seats. But now Democrats building up to a point where today they're at 2.3% nationwide. That is a good place to be if you're asking Democrats across the country, because they're looking at these metrics as a comparison point to where they were a month ago, and it shows room for growth for the national Democrats. The Democratic Party has been eyeing up a lot of these battleground states and districts for the 2024 race, and again, a lot of it has been largely contingent on who was at the top of the ticket. When you're taking a look at the 2024 election data, Kamala Harris, again, taking the lead nationwide to a pretty substantial point, especially compared to that of President Joe Biden, is good news for the Democratic Party and good news for these down-ballot Democrats. And they look at these metrics and they look at these indicators and say, we have a pathway to victory. We are in a position where the generic ballot is conducive to Democrats regaining control of the House of Representatives. And it becomes more likely than not. When it comes down to looking at the election from multiple lenses, you also have to understand, too, when you're looking at the Senate and gubernatorial races, the generic ballot is a very heavy indicator. It doesn't just pertain to House elections. It pertains to a lot more than that. And so I'm very interested to see how the ramifications of Kamala Harris's candidacy, what the ramifications rather are in these state legislative races that nobody's paying attention to, the state-wide races like Attorney General, State Comptroller, all of these heavy-set indicators that tell us the partisan lean of a state at default when the race isn't nationalized, when the race isn't heavy focused on, and actually gives us benchmarks to see where Kamala Harris did better, where Democrats did better, where Republicans did better, all of these different points that help us understand the impact of Kamala Harris's candidacy and just in general what the election results really tell us. And so 2024, I will say, the Democratic Party was off to a stronger point when you're looking back at the 2023 numbers, largely even with where they are today. A little bit under, but still maintaining a lead for months on end. Republicans didn't really reclaim that lead that they had in the generic ballot until August of 2023. And so it was around this point that the alarm bells started to ring for Democrats, that this election cycle was going to be a little bit more competitive than they would have hoped. I think many Democrats had come into 2024 under the assumption that Biden isn't going to lose because he's running against a rerun candidate, that this was not going to be a race that Republicans had a chance at winning, but the American public had other plans for them. And so we saw here the Democrats started losing the national lead, and then it became pretty consistent. As I was saying, Democrats occasionally took back the advantage, but never by more than just under a point. And so it took until today, in fact, this continuation of improvement for Democrats, it took until today for Democrats to reach a point where there is still that consideration of upward mobility, but also a difference between them and the Republicans that is starting to exit out of the margin of error, something the Democrats have really been hoping for, which would nearly guarantee an election victory, not counting a massive, massive polling difference, which we actually haven't seen too heavily when it comes down to the generic ballot. And again, on that point, too, of Democrats leading, a lot of Democrats look back at the 2018 midterms when Democrats were actually underestimated in the generic congressional vote. They actually look at this and say, maybe Democrats are on track for an even higher victory than what we saw in the last election. Other Democrats look at this in a more realistic sense and say, let's hope it's as accurate as it was in 2022, and that Republicans might have been narrowly underestimated. At large, it was still a heavy indicator, and even with Republicans winning by 2.5, Democrats did well in down-ballot races. And so that's another perspective I think Democrats look at this and say, the generic ballot, while very largely has been an indicator of Democratic success in the House of Representatives and the Senate, there are certainly circumstances where Democrats have far outpaced what the national popular vote would have suggested would have happened in some of these battleground states. To give additional context, I want us to look back at the 2020 presidential election, when Democrats and President Joe Biden won 4.5% more of the vote than that of former President Trump, at the time, President Donald Trump. Joe Biden not only won the Electoral College, but obliterated Donald Trump when it came down to the national popular vote with a 7 million vote difference, one of the largest deltas we have ever seen in United States history. And it was a margin that mattered. It was a margin that made an impact in the election and won the Democratic Party the House of Representatives, won them the Senate, and of course, won them the presidency. But the numbers weren't as good in 2022. We talked about this. In 2022, the generic vote here said Republicans were going to win by 2.5%. Almost every single poll, with the exception of two in the final stretch of the campaign, said that Republicans were doing quite well. Nationally, statewide, every metric was pointing to a red wave. But a red wave didn't happen. And although Republicans did, in fact, do as well as the polls were suggesting, in fact, slightly better, that didn't translate to swing state victories, which Democrats are hopeful will be the case in 2024. Look at Pennsylvania, for instance, a state that, again, Joe Biden won nationally by 4.5%. He won Pennsylvania by 1.2. In 2022, Democrats won it by over 5 points. When you take a look at a state like Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, these are all states that Joe Biden won with a 4.5% national victory, but we have swung that generic ballot in just under 2 years between 2020 and 2022, where Republicans, in fact, gained around 7 points nationwide. What happened? Well, Republicans did better because Biden was unpopular, and it was very much a monumental year for Republicans until it wasn't. A red wave turned into a red splash, really at most. The House elections begrudgingly went over to the Republican Party, and beyond that, the House races really didn't look so good when it came down to the nitty-gritty toss-ups. Democrats were fully writing off the House. By the end of the election cycle, Democrats were in a far better position than anyone could have hoped. And in the Senate, they not only maintained their Senate majority, but they gained seats against the Republicans. And so this 51-49 advantage that I look at and say, this is a telling sign of what a generic ballot, overcoming the generic ballot loss, can actually mean for national Democrats. And what's something that I think they can help replicate for their down ballot races in 2024 is that it is the same type of Republican that Democrats are running against, and the same type of Democrat that Democrats are running in the first place, which is a really good sign that they're in a position where they could do very well on the national scale. The generic ballot, I think, also, beyond just the congressional and down ballot races, helps us understand, too, around Kamala Harris's candidacy and the general impact of the Democratic brand. Back in 2018, it was very strong for national Democrats. You can take a look at the overall metrics. In 2020, it wasn't as strong as Biden's, but running roughly even. In 2022, though, we saw that Republicans ended up with the national lead in the final stretch of the campaign and actually maintained a pretty substantive lead up until the Dobbs decision in 2022. And then in 2024, it is slightly underrunning where that the margin of Vice President Kamala Harris against former President Trump. And so I think it's a really interesting way to track just overall Democratic performance, overall Democratic sentiment, because for a while, when Biden was losing nationwide, the numbers were actually pretty good for Democrats in comparison. But now, with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, largely possibly due to enthusiasm and excitement around her candidacy, overall, though, the point here is that Democrats, in fact, are doing slightly worse than that of Kamala Harris. And so I think this is a really good indicator, too, of just generally speaking, what is the relationship between Democratic performance and presidential election performance for Democrats? And they aren't always correlated. They aren't always connected. But one cannot deny that Democrats are doing better now that Kamala Harris is on the ticket, not only for themselves on the presidential, but again, also in these down ballot races. Looking back at the 2016 election as just another point to be made about Democrats making gains in a House election in a presidential election year, this is a really good example of a time frame in which the national popular vote actually went away from the Democratic Party, and yet they gained seats in the House. They gained 6 seats. 6 seats would be enough today to put Democrats in the majority in 2025. And so what we see here is the Hillary Clinton 2016 election, where she lost the national electoral vote count, 306 to 232, won the popular vote, though, by 2 points, but Republicans ended up winning the generic ballot in 2016 by roughly a point. And yet Democrats saw a 6-seat gain across the chamber, largely coming from states like Nevada and New Jersey, but beyond that, you weren't really seeing that much. Point being, though, Democrats were in a position where they did, in fact, gain seats. In 2020, though, it was a bit different. Even though Democrats did win the national popular vote by roughly 3.5 points, Democrats only narrowly held on to House control. But again, sort of speaks to the point that if this is the numbers today for Democrats, they might also narrowly win House control from the Republican Party. I think we also need to take a few steps back and understand that the generic ballot is not the end-all be-all for presidential tickets, Senate tickets, House tickets, because they really, really can vary. The 2022 midterms, I think a big reason why we saw Republicans do quite well in the national popular vote isn't necessarily that Democrats were in a position where they were getting obliterated in these, swing state districts, because we saw that they won the majority of them. If you take a look back at 2022, you go to the House elections, just scroll down to toss-up, you can see Democrats were doing quite well. When it came down to the districts that they were going to narrowly win, they won every single one. When it came down to some of the ones that Republicans were supposed to win, Democrats won one of those and ended up being in a position where some of their safe districts, like Colorado's 3rd, which was meant to be a blowout for the Republican Party, ended up being decided by less than a quarter of a percentage point. This would have been one of the closest races of the cycle, a very, very monumental one if it wasn't for some of these even closer races in states like New York. And so we get to that point, too, about the national generic ballot largely being driven in a rightward direction by states like New York. When you take a look at the top of the ticket in 2018, New York went to Andrew Cuomo by 23.4%. In 2022, Kathy Hochul only won New York by 6.4%. And we saw massive, massive changes in overall voter sentiment between 2020 and 2022, largely in New York and some of these other safe blue states because of lackluster Democratic candidates that translated. Again, a lot of these races in the gubernatorial race are at the top of the ticket, or the Senate race are at the top of the ticket. With bad Democrats comes bad performances and bad national metrics. New York saw a massive overhaul of their House Democrats from 2018 through 2020. When you saw, then 2022 came, Democrats went from 19 seats, 21 in 2018, 19 in 2020, down to just 15 in 2022. I mean, you are talking about losing 6 seats in your delegation in just 4 years, and the reason being the national and top-line Democrats in the state of New York did not do well. When you look at New York's 17th, you look in New York's 22nd, these are Biden districts. New York's 19th, Biden district. New York's 4th, Biden district. New York's 3rd, Biden district. These are districts that voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election, in some cases by double digits. But it is because these down-ballot races went so poorly for Democrats. It translated to Republicans getting boosted from a very populous state in the 2022 election cycle and just completely warped our perception and analysis leading into this election. Because had New York voted the same way that many of the other states did in comparison to 2020, Democrats would have maintained the House majority and they would have had another 2 years of a trifecta. But it is because of New York and some other states where you saw massive vote dumps in favor of Republicans, like Florida, very populous ones, where Republicans won the popular vote in Florida by 18 points. Donald Trump only won the state by 3 in the 2020 election. So an 18-point margin, New York narrows down tremendously for the Democratic Party compared to the Republican Party. You saw it in some other states too. At large, the Republicans were able to do so well when it came down to the popular vote share because they held a number of these districts and were running up the margins in some more populous ones, even if Democrats were winning the overwhelming majority of these toss-up districts. And so that's why the generic ballot also is just not a perfect indicator because, again, by that standard and metric alone, you would not have been able to foresee the Democrats were winning in states like Pennsylvania. The Democrats were winning in states like Arizona and Georgia. It would have been a massive, massive, mind F if I was looking at this from the 2020 election, which is why we have to look at 2024 with a very different lens. I think to wrap up here, what I wanted to watch over the next coming months is how the presidential debate and some other events really impact the 2024 cycle, not only for, of course, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. We talk a lot about those two, but these down ballot races where it could determine whether or not Donald Trump has an effective government, whether or not Kamala Harris has an effective government. And given the 2024 map, Democrats don't have much hope when it comes down to maintaining the Senate majority. But the generic ballot does give us a general indicator of how Democratic performance is looking nationwide, how voters view them, how voters respond to them, how they interact with both sides of the aisle, who they prefer versus not. All of these things are important, and they all give us a better understanding of this election. 2024 so far, Democrats lead by 2.3% on average in the generic ballot, nearing 47% nationwide, largely running even with that of Vice President Harris. Republicans slightly outperforming that of former President Donald Trump, with 45% nationwide, again down 2.3% instead of being down 3.2%, like Kamala Harris with her lead over former President Trump. This election will be very close, and it will be exciting to watch. The House races, Senate, gubernatorial, and of course, the presidential race. It's a very close and competitive election. And everything is going to matter, including these down-ballot races that might have a tremendous up-ballot effect that favors Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, depending on what we see over the next 2 months. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server if you can go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.